Out here, the West ain't just dust and gun smoke, it's blood, betrayal, and legends carved in iron. These are the forgotten tales of outlaws, lawmen, and drifters chasing gold, vengeance, and redemption. Welcome to Dust and Iron Tales. In the red rock canyons of Utah's Badlands, tidal paths lay like a held breath, brittle and desperate as late spring thaws began. The town's rickety four-story clock tower loomed above, its brass face perpetually shining, a stubborn beacon against the landscape's greys and browns. Analyzed the Minute Maid at 28, moved with the precise economy of a scientist, her European workhorse stock against denim and dust. Her only defense was a rare, perfectly calibrated chronometer lodge, portable and ruthlessly accurate, always tucked close. Vernon the Dry Duke, the rancher with wind-dried ambitions, had secretly dammed upstream to bottle every drop for his estate, defying the laws in the land. Through seismic memos and mineral deposits, Analyze had calculated that the spring melt's trap pressure would fail in a cloudburst that could obliterate the pass, and, ironically, wash Duke's own sprawling ranch into the canyon's mouth as the flood roared down. Duke arrived with two hired thugs, scalp-creased hats, and the large cane of a clock. Tower was an eyesore and a symbol of resistance to his rule. The men began to sort the clock tower's supporting beams, the spiraling like pale snow in the dim light of late afternoon. Analyze climbed the stairs with the calm, relentless rhythm of a metronome, determined not to be driven by fear but to measure it. She reached the bell mechanism at the top and studied it as if it were a fragile species, converting the approaching chaos into a calculable force. The first distant crack of the dam's failure echoed through the canyon, a low thunder that made the timber shudder. With the town's dab pressing on her like a weighted coat, she began to wind the mainspring far beyond its ordinary limits, guided by the chronometer's ruthless dial. A shiver spun the spring, the pendulum's brass shaft unfurled with a savage speed, and the clock face shattered in a shower of glass. A brilliant, rhythmic beacon erupted from the tower, a bright, pulsing signal that cut across the canyon and told the town in an ambiguous light that doom had arrived. Duke's shouts were swallowed by the flood's roar as the beacon's glare hammered the truth. The review of time had run out for cunning and bravado. The canyon trembled as waters surged, and Analyze rode the tower's collapse down toward the river, clinging to splintered wood in the memory of measured patience. The surge carried her to the muddy bank where the town's people crouched on high ground, their relief held in a shared, damp breath. When the final wave withdrew, she stood in the mud, clock tower ruined behind her, her chronometer miraculously intact, beating with a patient, stubborn pulse. The final image is of Analyze standing in the mud, the clock tower ruined behind her, her small chronometer miraculously intact, having used the principles of time and pressure to defeat greed. The mud clung to her boots as she moved, listening to the distant clink of falling glass. The chronometer pricked at her wrist with a stubborn glow, a pulse of earned time. In her pocket, coins from the greedy vault rattled but failed to warm. They were nothing now. She recalled the moment when the tower's hands had been turned backward, not by force, but by a bargain broken with a breath. Time, she knew, is a pressure as much as a rhythm, a weight that reshapes intention. The ruined tower stood behind her like a memory chiseling away at the present. She pressed the chronometer, and the memory of the crowd's greed flushed through her mind in quiet echoes. Ahead, the city wore a skin of sludge, slick and patient, waiting for someone to slip. She walked through the mire as if the ground remembered the names of those who lied to themselves. Her breath formed a small white cloud that drifted toward a distant arched doorway. Inside, the air tasted of iron and old paper, promises made and unkept. She knew the next test would not be a battle of force, but of time and small, patient gaps. The chronometer hummed, ticking a countdown that wasn't tears alone to bear. In the doorway, a figure waited, eyes glittering with the greed that survived every ruin. They spoke of profits and futures, but she heard a clockwork rattle the machinery of their own fear. She offered them a choice: relinquish the gold-bearing echoes of the city or become a chapter in its undoing. They stepped closer to the edge of the threshold, and the ground trembled as if the earth dared them to choose again. The chronometer released a tiny flare, and the pressure released around the greed like a spring uncoiling. The would-be buyer faltered, agreed within the month's booth, and the room grew quiet enough to hear a single heartbeat. She moved on, the ruin listening, the mud softening underfoot. Time and pressure now guiding her toward the next ruin to mend. The air carried the memory of rain, and she let it wash over her like a soft apology. A doorway stood half revealed by hiding, and she stepped through where the shadow invited her. The inside smelled of old rain and unused hours, a sweetness that knew every corner. She traced faint lines on a wall where lime had peeled away, feeling for the pattern that time kept insisting on. A hinge groaned a sound like a spine bending back toward truth, and she bent to steady it. The rune spoke in whispers of sea salt and burnt timber, and she listened for the language she remembered. Her tools clinked softly, not as metal, but as memory returning to its rightful place. She found a pedestal cracked in two. It set her palm to the seam as if coaxing it to open. A subtle tremor ran through the stones, and she knew the structure was still listening, waiting for permission to breathe again. She pressed her finger to a carved symbol, and the dust rearranged itself into a map she could read. The map pointed toward a stairwell that led into the earth, where roots pressed soft crowns against stone. She descended carefully, each step a note in a quiet hymn to endurance. In the lower chamber, a pool reflected light like a mind's eye, and the ripples carried names she did not yet know. A broken vessel lay on its side, and she righted it with a gentleness that surprised even her. The water within sang as it settled, and the echo stitched the chamber back into a single breath. On the far wall, a mural half erased revealed an eye watching, patient and tired but hopeful. She traced the eye's pupil with her fingertip and felt a thread pull taut from one ruin to another. The next ruin did not resist her. It yielded a little, bowing to the quiet authority she carried. She lifted her chest, feeling the weight of time shift, learning that meant and memory shared the same dust. As she rose toward the surface again, the sun broke through the cracks, and the ruin she left behind seemed to sigh with approval, already counting on her for the next repair. She stepped through the doorway as light pooled like warm honey on the dust. The ruin exhaled a brittle sighing, as if grateful for the chance to be touched again. Her toolkit clanked softly, a lullaby to the stubborn bones of the place. The walls, still jagged with time, welcomed her touch as if recognizing an old friend. A small crack near the window widened, then narrowed as if blinking awake. She traced the line with a careful finger, measuring the distance between past harm and future mint. Outside, a lark stitched a note across the morning, and the town woke with a shy brightness. She found the hint she needed in a tin box labeled for the patient transformations. A wink from the old wooden cabinet. The sun stitched gold along the sill, and the room seemed to lean into the light, listening. Each nail she hammered sounded like percussive rain against old stone, a rhythm of revival. This rose in a small galaxy, settling again as if bowing to the order she imposed. The rune sigh grew softer, almost pleased enough to whisper a thanks. She spoke aloud to no one, naming the rooms as if they wore their own histories on their sleeves. When a bead of sweat trickled down her temple, she wiped it away and kept going, patient as a gardener. The cracked plaster yielded to her palm, releasing a chalky scent that felt like memory. Somewhere a child laughed from a window, and the sound braided warmth into the air. She pressed a patch of tile into place, smooth and flat, and it hummed with a quiet homecoming. The ruin settled into a slow, grateful exhale as the first beams of repair sun found the corners. In the mirror of broken glass, she saw not a rescuer but a caretaker who had learned to listen to the thin, stubborn heart of stone. When she finally stepped back, the room breathed a long, contented breath, and the next repair waited, patient and true. She did not rush to the next tool, letting her eyes map the quiet geometry of the space. The tools rested like patient soldiers gleaming with a soft, almost ceremonial light. A thread of dust swam through a beam of sun, then settled back into the shared memory of the room. She chose the smallest wrench first, as if it held the least stubbornness and promised a gentler beginning. The screwdriver clicked into place with a whisper she barely heard over her own breath. She remembered the words the room had ever whispered to her, the old house that kept its promises, the quiet that followed labor. The first hinge woke under her touch, smoothing its side into a hinge of smooth motion. Outside, a sparrow paused on the sill, as if listening for the rhythm of metal and wood to return to its ordinary tempo. The air grew cooler as the filament of decay retreated, replaced by the clean scent of oil and pine. She marked the progress with a line on the notebook she kept for such evenings, a map of small victories. The repair itself felt less like mending and more like conversation, two old friends agreeing to meet again tomorrow. When the latch finally clicked, it held the door with the same quiet reverence as a prayer. A clatter somewhere else reminded her that the house was listening, patient and watchful. She moved on to the second corridor, where pipes hummed a low, contented tune. Each bolt loosened and then tightened reminded her that patience was not passive, but precise. She paused to wipe her palms on the apron, and the fabric caught the light like a leaf turned gold. In the back room, she found the old clock that had run out of time, and she coaxed it to tick again with careful alignment. The mechanism worked with a faint sigh, As if waking from a nap, it remembered how long it had waited. With the clock steady, the house finally seemed to tilt toward warmth, as if shedding a last winter chill from its bones. The room settled into a quiet, satisfied glow, and she understood that repairs, like stories, were only complete when they learned to wait for the right breath. The room settled into a quiet, satisfied glow, and she understood that repairs, like stories, were only complete when they learned to wait for the right breath. She stood for a moment and let the dust motes drift in the lamplighters. If they were tiny, patient witnesses. On the table lay a map of patched edges and stitched promises, each crease carrying a choice she hadn't yet announced to the world. Her fingers found their way to the wood of the chair, tracing the grain that remembered every decision it had carried. A soft rain began outside, tapping the window in a language only patience could translate. She thought of the repairs she had begun, and of the ones she had paused, and felt the weight shift toward gentleness. The house seemed to lean closer, as if eager to hear the next line before it was spoken. Mending, she realized, was a practice of listening as much as fixing, of letting time do the work it was born to do. She whispered aloud to the room, rehearsing a sentence that had not yet found its end. The kettle hissed a second, then softened, as if the steam were a small apology and a promise at once. She poured tea for herself and for the memory perched at the edge of the sofa, the one who wore yesterday like a favorite coat. The memory spoke without heat, a rustle of pages, insisting that every fracture had learned something else in the night. In her pocket, a folded note warmed with the fragrance of old ink and new beginnings. She tucked it away again and breathed, letting the air rearrange the thoughts that crowded the morning. The repairs would not rush to finish. They would drift toward completion on the slow pulse of a quiet house. She gathered the loose ends of the day and tied them with the thread she coaxed from the tale of her story. When the last task settled, she felt the small, stubborn hope rise, not certainty, but a calm willingness to keep tending. She realized that every repaired thing carried a name now, and that naming was a kind of gratitude. Outside, the rain softened to a mist, and the night nodded, approving the patient work that had just begun to bear fruit. And so, with the room alive with the memory of repair, she turned the page in her own story and listened for the next breath to arrive. The room breathed with patient, ceremonial calm. She turned the page again, and the edges sighed as if relieved to be read. The memory of repair drifted through the walls like a soft wind that knew every nail's history. She listened for the next breath to arrive, and found it in the spaces between words. The lamp offered a pale halo, as if it too remembered how to glow without fear. On the table, a chipped teacup collected dust that tasted faintly of yesterday's sweetness. She traced the rim with a fingertip, counting the little ear as the cup had survived. The story loosened a hinge inside her, and a corridor opened where fear had once blocked the way. Footsteps sounded downstairs, or perhaps they were the echo of her own doubts returning for coffee. She chose to listen to the more general sound of the breath that followed the opening of a door. In the margin, a note written in someone else's hand suggested that repair was a shared weather, not a solitary task. She smiled at the notion of collaboration between plaster and hope. The air smelled faintly of oil and rain, two odors she had learned to mistake for home. She saw the page as a window she could walk through, not a trap to trap her in lines. Each sentence seemed to tighten its belt and offer a softer finish. She imagined the room answering back with a chorus of small, forgiving sounds. When a draft rattled the window, she welcomed it as a herald, not a threat. The next breath, when it finally came, carried the consonants of courage she had almost forgotten to pronounce. She pressed her palm to her chest and felt the repair complete, not in the room but inside herself. And so she read on, sure that the next breath would arrive exactly when she needed it most. The room hummed with the faint trace of rain tapping against the window. Words spilled from the page like little boats, guiding her back to shore. She paused to listen for her own heartbeat, tapping in time with the clock on the wall. Every sentence seemed to tilt the air, lifting a corner of the night that had pressed down. When a paragraph ended, she exhaled and found a match for the ache between her ribs. The protagonist's courage echoed in hers, a soft mirror that grew larger with each line. Outside, the storm gathered, a dusty lightning flickering across the clouds. Inside, a candle burned down to its last whisper, throwing gold across the spine of the book. On the page, a map and further places she might still reach as she kept turning. Her fingers found the next page and the world didn't pause, but it rearranged itself. She learned to count breaths the way someone counts beads in a rosary, one by one. The next line described a door swinging open on its old brass hinge, and her breath followed. In that moment, she realized the story was not just about reaching a destination, but about arriving. The sting of rain hit the sill, and she smiled, because the sound was a punctuation mark she could listen to. When the room grew quiet again, the words steadied, becoming a thread she could hold. A sudden memory of a name rose from the margins, and it felt both familiar and newly summoned. She pressed the book closer until the words pressed back, inviting her to step through. And so she did, not into a place, but into a decision she had deferred for too long. The air changed as her breathing found its rhythm, steady as tight and twice as hopeful. Somewhere in the distance, the storm released a final sigh, and she walked forward with her next breath already counted. The rain slackened, turning to a fine drizzle that stitched the air with silver threads. She moved with a measured patience, as if each step were a note in a quiet song only she could hear. Behind her, the wind kept its distance, learning to listen instead of roar. The sidewalks glowed with the pale green of street lamps that flickered back to life. In the pocket of her coat, a small talisman hummed, a memory sealed inside glass. It had survived the storm's teeth as if it knew what would come next. She passed storefronts with shattered glass winked like broken stars, and kept walking. The city smelled of rain and iron and something sweet she couldn't name. A stray dog trotted up, then paused, sensing something in her gait, and followed a few paces behind. They reached the old bridge where the river had shifted its voice and carried new currents. Below, the water wore the color of pewter, reflecting the clouds as if they were listening for orders. She paused at the railing, counting the breaths of the river as if they were old friends. The talisman grew warmer against her chest, and she knew she carried more than she believed. A distant horn sounded somewhere, a signal or a memory, and the dog barked once in answer. She stepped onto the bridge, feeling the world tilt back toward balance, fragile and bright. Far ahead, a window winked with a yellow light, inviting her in without knowing her name. She crossed the span in the space between two heartbeats, grounded by the pulse of footsteps beside her. The storm's last sigh lingered in the air, a breath she could taste as salt and iron on her tongue. When the door finally opened, it did so with the soft forgiveness of a welcome, not a summons. Inside, a chorus of quiet voices waited to tell us of weather, keepers of memories, and a chair that waited for her to sit and begin again. The air tasted of rain-soft ash and old paper. When she stood at the threshold, the room breathed in time with her. The chair waited, not impatiently, but with the quiet gravity of a door that opens inward. A memory light flickered in the corner, a small lighthouse for late evenings. The weather tellers whispered about the forecast of her hands, which days would tremble, which would steady. The keepers of memories drew on the chalkboard of the mind, erasing some lines, highlighting others. She sank into the chair and felt the wood remember the first time she chose to speak. A chorus of soft pebbles clicked under her shoes as if counting her steps. The room held its breath while she gathered the syllables she had stored like seashells. Outside, the street softened into a pale map of rain. She opened her mouth and a quiet wind and spool from it, threading through the room. The weather tellers shifted their balance, predicting a gentle wind and a long patience. The memories replied in photographs that fluttered from the air, landing face up on the desk. Each photograph carried the scent of lemon rind and grandmother's scarf. The chair leaned a fraction toward her, inviting a new sentence to be carved into its grain. She spoke then of small losses and the way tiny doors open when you listen. The keepers of memories nodded, not with consent but with recognition, as if saying, yes, we have waited for this exact word. The room thickened with the sigh of a book finally opened to its first page. In the corner, a lamp spilled a pale gold that felt almost like forgiveness. When her voice found its length, the chorus answered in a harmony that sounded like rain returning to a dry town.